Hello, everyone. This is Ivy and Ray, and we feel very honored today to be invited by the ABP convening team to share our experience on how to make a matter file. Ray, can you begin by talking about the importance of making a matter file?
Yep. So several things before we start to introduce the way we are making that case file. I think firstly is to make a case file is a process of learning. So even if you can see that there are many different good debaters sharing their case files, which is necessarily a good thing, but we kind of think that it's still a process when you're trying to make your own. So their metafiles could be a reference and a good point in terms of for you to know about which is a good case file, but it cannot replace a process because when you're making your own case file, it's also a process of learning. Secondarily, I think different people may have different ways of making that case file. So probably you want to have your own way of making your own case file. Sometimes you want to focus on different topics that probably you are weak upon. For example, you feel like you're quite weak on IR, probably you're going to put more efforts in making a more IR focused case file. Then you can probably use the form that you like. And thirdly is probably when you're making that case file, you want to adjust it to the different tournaments that you want to participate. For example, if you are participating in ABP and ABP is like happening in Southeast Asia, you probably want to prepare like more content on the region in terms of the politics, in terms of economy, etc., etc. You can to some degree expect that there are necessarily going to be topics about it. And second, you can just look at different CAs. For example, you're participating in ABP, you want to take a look at the CA's history and try to figure out what are their preferences and some of the topics that is going to be their favorite one. And you want to probably put more efforts into that as well. And thirdly, you also want to take a look at what is happening recently so that some of the news might be quite topical. The CAs are also going to use that as a reference for them to think about new ideas, etc., etc. So you want to adjust your case file to different tournaments that you're participating in. Lastly is although making a case file is a good thing for you to learn, for you to know different arguments, you necessarily need to be critical when you are trying to apply that in the specific round. Because some of the debaters, when they feel like, oh, it's a topic that I feel like some of my case file might help, and then they directly copy that and just apply that, but they didn't think about the nuances of the specific wording of that motion. So when you're trying to apply the matter that you have prepared, please be critical. We are probably going to demonstrate that later in an example, but just try to be critical. Even if you make that case file, try to think about whether or not it can apply to the topic that you're trying to debate. Good. I think then Ivy will just talk about, I'm going to then talk about how to identify the topic first. That just moves to the part that we are going to talk about how we are preparing different case file. So I think the first step for you to prepare a case file is just to identify the topics. Try to identify what are the key fields of the motions. A way for you to do this is probably just find some tabs and try to just copy 20 or 30 of the motions. I try to categorize different areas or different fields of the motion. Um, because that's sort of the way that CAs come up with the motion as well, right? They try to balance different topics. They try to balance, for example, soft motions and hard motions, different areas of the motions. So when you can identify different topics and then you just put different motions into that different topic, is also a way for you to think about the later step in terms of, for example, identify the key clashes for that topic as well. But for the first step is just to think about what are exactly the areas I'm preparing. For example, you can see the example there. When we are preparing a tournament, then we try to come up with different areas of topics. For example, you can see education, and you can see, for example, more economic stuff and more, for example, IR stuff, etc., etc. So just try to identify different areas of the motions and try to subdivide them into different areas, and then just fill them with, for example, the content. Yep. Then the next step, I'm going to give the stage to Ivy to talk about, after you identify the topic, how do you actually fill in the content?
Yeah. So probably you can first make a content about different topics. So you can like divide your case file into the areas that Ray talked about. And afterwards, we need some details to make each field more useful. So we think there are 5 things that you can look at. The first is general theory. The second one is common clashes. The third one is case studies. I'll combine the third and fourth one together. So you can also add in news into case studies. And lastly is on classical motions. I'm going to talk about general theories, case studies, and classical motions, and Ray will talk about like the common clashes. So first on general theories. So by general theories, we mean for each subject, usually there are already existing theories that can assist you to understand the clashes better. So this does not need to be something that is very, very specific, but something that's relatively more broad and general, and you can translate it into arguments based on different motions. So the first thing that you can do is to look up and prepare for keywords. This is especially helpful for some of the rounds that are very, very technical. For example, for a little finance debate, you probably need to know some specific terms, like, for example, what is inflation? What is stagnation? What causes inflation? Or like, for example, quantitative easing. What is quantitative easing? What are the situations or like current news that are related to quantitative easing? Second step is to like learn about some classical theories. So here I'll give some examples regarding international relations because that's a topic that I'm more familiar with. So you can prepare like the 3 classical schools. So the first one will be realism, second one will be liberalism, and last one will be constructivism. So I know there's a lot of confusion here. Many people feel like even if I prep the theories, it's very hard to use it or apply them in actual debates. So I would advise you to look into more details of classical theories. So for example, for realism, I think most of the people are familiar with this. So it's about when countries make decision, they consider realistic like threats or calculations. So for example, a typical argument within the realism field would be international relation is in constant anarchy, so countries feel insecure all the time. Therefore, it's more likely for them to do whatever they can to protect their security. This seems to be hard to apply to a debate, but some sub-theories below realism, for example, the security dilemma, like when countries develop weapons, they get themselves into arm race because of non-transparency and the lack of confidence. They constantly doubt the intention of their opponents and probably develop more weapons in order to maximize their capacity for self-protection. So security dilemma and arm race can be a very useful debate logical chain for you to explain some of the arguments, especially if the argument is related to like arms or especially nuclear weapon. The second one is on liberalism. So similarly, if you look at liberalism alone, it means we can have, for example, like international cooperation is possible even under the state of anarchy. So this is possible for several reasons. Probably it's possible because there can be international institutions such as United Nations, such as like different forms like European Union or whatever. Second way would be related to international economy. So like trade can be a useful way to foster interdependence. Interdependence is key to reduce the possibility of conflict because because under this context, opting into war also hinders like countries' own self-interest. So similarly, like liberalism arguing that under international anarchy, there's also room for cooperation is probably not that useful in a debate. But if you look at interdependence, such as how trade can foster peace, this can be very, very useful in a debate. So you can argue, like you can apply this argument to debate that's related to tariff or related to trade barriers. Yeah. Lastly, on constructivism. So constructivism key concept is international anarchy is not absolute. It is a socially agreed concept. So it's because people think that international relation is in constant anarchy and that perception shape like the interactions that countries have. So similarly, these probably look hard to be applied to a debate, but the key concept of constructivism is if international relation or your own identity is shaped, then it can also be altered to be other things. So this can be useful in debates such as nationalism versus cosmopolitanism. So for example, regarding the debate about post-conflict state, what should government do? Like what language should they use, or what focus should they put on? Should they focus on unity or prosperity, nationalism, or being a world citizen? These are actually common topics and theories under constructivism. So this bulk of analysis that I provided, I just like attempt to say, sometimes general theories might look too broad or irrelevant to debate, but if you think deeper into the details of the theories and reflect on the topics that we have, you can actually find them to be quite useful. So don't just like have a very broad understanding or like, think they're useless, but like try to maybe look into the sub theories under the general topics and it will become more useful. So except for classical theories, there's also critical theories. I think critical theories is useful in providing a framework or in providing, generally speaking, the rebuttals, because critical theories by nature is to rebut classical theories as well. So like, for example, post-colonialism, it's challenging Eurocentric view ideas. Like, for example, typical post-colonialism, like theories would focus on the use of language, like how language is shaping like our understanding towards politics, or focus on education. So like how the textbooks or like case studies that we select are affecting people's understanding towards the current world. So these can also be useful towards some of the debate as well. Postmodernism is to say that many things that we believe in right now are shaped by the modernization like process. This is especially useful in environmental debate. So it's talking about like overemphasis on progress or linear development isn't something that we should pursue. So yeah, so like similarly, just try to look at different fields and areas that these theories can apply to, and this can be useful. Yeah. So next. Yeah. Oh, yeah. But yeah, as I said, sometimes probably people will find the theories to be too abstract, and some of the topics are not very, very matter heavy. So it's hard to apply the theories. So for these topics, probably prepping for the common clashes will be very, very useful. And Ray will talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's also kind of like a process in terms of the way that we are making our case file. Is more likely if you take a look at the 4 steps, right? Firstly, we identify like the general field, and then we search for some general theories, and then we find some common clashes, and then we just look at some specific case studies to kind of like know how to apply them. So when you are trying to make that case file, especially later stages, when you're making, for example, case studies, when you are reading news, you can also think about how it is related to what I have previously done, right? For example, when we already done some work in terms of knowing about the general theories, and later when you're seeing some news, when you are making some case studies, relate it back to the theory and see how it is interconnected is also a way that can probably help. Yep. So for common clashes, I think the first thing to say is how do we actually identify some common clashes? I think firstly is just, for example, when we are trying to prepare the general theory at the first step, when you're prepping that, you to some degree can expect some of them can be directly clashing with each other. For example, realism and liberalism is to some degree kind of like directly opposing each other to some degree. And that's the first step when you're trying to prepare the general theory. You kind of like know that there are some conceptual differences and there are some kind of clashes that might happen between them. Because if you think about how these academics work as well, right? Sometimes someone has a theory and then necessarily the other try to outcompete them and try to rebut that or try to come up with a new theory. It's to some degree already forms certain kind of like clashes that you can identify to begin with. And second is just it might come from the experience that you have when you're doing debate. For example, when you have done some similar debates, you kind of like know that there are some of the clashes that will happen necessarily. So you can, to some degree, prepare the general way that you can think about this issue and then just apply them to different nuanced topics. For example, when we are talking about social movement, some of the things that you can expect quite easily is probably because like firstly whether or not this movement could become more radical, or you want a more moderate way of like having that social movement. Because a lot of, for example, when you see a lot of the motions, it's just a way of expressing whether or not you want to be more radical or more moderate. Yep, and secondarily is probably a clash that you can think about is probably whether or not the movement can do it strategically, and or versus you cannot do it strategically, because that's oftentimes when you are doing the framing that you necessarily can think about this point, and your opponents won't let you just get away with it quite easily, so that they're also going to prepare things like talking about why they're unable to do that strategically. And for example, the third point is probably when you're thinking about social movements, sometimes sometimes when you see some environment motions, some environment movements, whether or not the current context of them is developing or declining, is to some degree going to affect the way that how you're going to frame this debate, right? Because if they're kind of like developing, you want to argue that, for example, there is some hope, or there is some kind of chances for it to become successful, versus if they are declining, how people are going to perceive that, and what is their kind of like the political power that they have in the status quo, etc., etc. This is going to necessarily affect how you are going to frame that. I also want to note that when you already have that common clashes, sometimes you prepare some logical reasons as to explain why this is good or bad, but you still need to, for example, look at the exact motions to apply how these nuances actually fit into the general reasons that you have. Right. For example, obviously there is a general clash about more radical or more moderate, but in terms of the mechanism, in terms of how the social movement will probably going to do that, it's quite different, right? So you need to, for example, think about obviously the common impact of that is, for example, for a radical movement that is more radical, it is probably going to be, for example, more loyal to the most loyalist supporters, versus a moderate, you're more going to appeal to the people in the middle, etc., etc. But obviously, it is different in terms of which kind of social movement we are talking about and what are the kind of like the potential supporters you want to attract. So although it's going to be helpful for you to know about the general argument, or more like the logical reasoning, but when you're trying to apply that, you want to think about the nuanced application in terms of which group of people we are talking about and what are the specific psychology that they have. So that also moves on to why we think it's quite important to do some case studies after you know about some common clashes and the logical reasoning of that common clashes. Yep.
Okay, so after the clashes and theories, we can move on to like something that is more specific. So we can look at the case studies. I think case studies can serve as probably three functions. The first one is they can serve as examples for you to make your arguments more convincing. Like, so for example, if you give a lot of mechanism and a lot of reasoning, sometimes when you add in some of the like examples or just do some name calling on countries that are experiencing the same thing, it probably make your case more convincing. For me personally, because sometimes I'm bad at mechanizing things, so I would also use examples or visualization on those examples to make up the logical gap that I don't know how to prove in some of the rounds. The second way that case studies can help you is to give you logical assistance. Sometimes probably you will think of an case study when you see a motion. Like, for example, usually when I see a motion related to ethnic conflicts, I would think about the case in India or think about the case in Rwanda. So then I would look at the examples and see what happened in the examples and then summarize more abstract logical reasoning behind it. So for example, looking at the case in India about what language should they use. The reason why they opt into English is because for different provinces and tribes in India, they have very, very different language. So like it's hard to prioritize one language over another. So making it more abstract, it can be in post-conflict state due to like a massive amount of diversity within the nation, probably oftentimes as an outcome of colonial ruling, like separate and rule and stuff like that. Prioritizing one culture over another probably induce more conflicts and tension. That is a reason why a lot of post-conflict states opt into English as their official language. So this can be a way that initially I didn't really know about post-conflict state, but I know the example of India. So looking at the case of India and summarize it in a debate, it helped me to form a more abstract argument that can be useful. Yeah, the third way is area studies. This means when you are making a case file, sometimes it's not only field-based. Like for example, it's not only about different topics like economics, AI, politics, or whatsoever. They can also be divided by areas. Like for example, you can put Europe and then ASEAN countries, and then Africa, and then Latin America and stuff. And then by doing area studies, this is helpful in two ways. First one is some of the topics are very specific in one region. This is especially the case when tournaments happen in a specific country. Oftentimes there are motions that are related to the country. Like for example, when me and Ray went to Kida Open, we studied some like Korean specific topics as well. So like area studies and making your case file in that way can help you to like adapt to the topic specifically. The second one is for area studies. Similarly, you can also summarize some abstract logics in this. So for example, studying the case of Latin America, then you would probably like if you're studying about Latin America economic policy, then it also generally can like represent case regarding reliance on export and import and prioritizing your own domestic industry. So it can be a very good example regarding industrial policies and stuff. Yeah. Lastly, for case studies, it need to be up to date. So it will also be useful if you look at some news and summarize some news. So for all of this, me and Ray also want to recommend two sources that we use for prep. So the first one is the first one is Vox video. You can find it on, not Fox, Vox video. You can find it on YouTube. They provide some, I think, quite in-depth analysis on the like currently very heatedly discussed topics. The second one would be Crash Course. Another reason why I like Vox is also because I think some of the rhetorics and visualization in Vox is very, very well done. So it's not very boring, but like it's quite how to say, I think it's quite it's quite emotionally appealing. So like it can also be useful to improve rhetorics in debates. Like some of the quotes or ways that Vox video used to like provide arguments are quite helpful. The second one is Crash Course. Probably a lot of people already know about it. I really like Crash Course philosophical session. They provide not only the theories, but also like sometimes thought bubbles or thought experiments, like specific examples to help you to understand it. I think this is useful because some of the philosophical theories can be quite hard to explain in debate. So through the thought experiment and the like examples that they provide, it can also be a useful way that debaters can use to like convey their ideas in a round as well. Okay, next.
Yep. Can I add something on this? Yeah,
Of
so I think
course.
one, I think I want to kind of like add more on like the sources. I feel like for people who are willing to watch videos, I think Vox crash courses and also some like visual politic and also TLDR news is quite helpful for me to know about what is happening around and what are, for example, the general thesis as we talked about in like crash course, etc., etc. So I think so there are different forms you can search to if you are not a very keen on reading, but also if you are quite keen on reading, you can also make some subscription on some like the news website, for example, the like the New Yorker or like the Atlantic or Foreign Policy, etc., etc. So I think these websites are also quite helpful for you to know about what is happening around. That's the first thing I want to add. But also I feel like I think it is quite important for you to know these different cases, as Avi told you, that sometimes you can use it to reversely think about the mechanism that is going to be helpful. But I think also in like modern debating, it is quite helpful in a way that one, it just help you to become much more persuasive when you're lower house, because sometimes your upper house might already have like the general mechanism, but they're not nuanced, kind of like not nuanced enough. So a way for you to become much more, have much more nuanced analysis is just to know exactly what is happening. So it could be very helpful for you to use that to weigh this above your upper house. But I think secondarily is in like modern debating, it's like everyone have ChatGPT, everyone like have these AI tools. So it is easy for them to prepare for the logical reasoning, but it's a bit hard for them to actually have an accurate case study in terms of what is really happening around. So sometimes when you have like competing mechanism, which one is more likely, it is hard to tell because it stand like both of them stand quite logically. But if you know about the real case studies, it just help you to persuade the judges that why the mechanism you provide is probably to become more related to the real world and why this is just going to be more persuasive. Yep.
Okay, so next, regarding classical motions, so I think these can also be very helpful, given that a lot of times, even if we have different motions, sometimes the underlying principle or underlying mechanism for motions are similar, especially when they belong to similar themes. So it will be really helpful for debaters to prep themselves with previous motions and materials. So we have recommended 3 sources. The first one is direct YouTube videos. So you can search the competitions. Here I search WUDC, and these are the past WUDC videos. I know some people are really dedicated to this. So to the extent they can literally just look at a motion and immediately know this motion was debated in which tournament before and list out like the arguments provided by different houses. I really admire it. Like, yeah. So I think this can be a very helpful way. I have also heard debaters like in round saying, oh, we run the argument provided by like WEDC finalist in blah blah video. So it can be a very convenient way for you to prep for arguments. But for people like me, sometimes I find it too long to finish a debate video. So you can directly find the transcript of some of the rounds. So here there's a website called Debating 404 that they summarize the transcript of some of the most classical rounds. So it can be an easier way, or like if it's easier for you to read rather than to focus and listen. Lastly is our motion bank. So like you can search up the motions on the website. So it's also characterized by different themes, different keywords, and different tournaments. This can be very useful for your practice. So like in practice debate, you can either just like look at the motion banks and do a PM speech on it, or you can just look at the motion banks and prep for clashes with your partner. Or you can even use emotion bank as a way to double check the field and subtopics of the content of the matter file that we mentioned. Yeah. So lastly, we're going to look at emotion and probably showcase how we're going to utilize the matter file during the prep time. Yeah.
Yep. So the example we have provided is this house believe that citizens have a moral duty to participate in democratic process. So as you can see, this debate is about democracy. So if previously you have already identified the different fields that probably you are going to include that part in politics, or you have like subdivision in terms of democracy. Ivy has already had a case file probably going to be related to that. She'll just showcase in terms of how she select the useful materials and how these materials could be possibly applied to this example.
Yeah. Before that, we want to say that probably in actual tournaments and rounds, it's impossible to do it like this because looking at your case file also takes up time that you have to discuss with your partner and to write your cases. So we don't really advise you to spend a lot of time referring to your case file in rounds. So I think the best way is to like prep your case file with your partner so you guys know exactly what each other are talking about. So you are very familiar with the case file, like both of you. So that can save you time in discussing the topics. But like for the purpose of this video of how to make a case file, we're going to look at the matter file and say like what are the materials that are applicable to the debate.
Yeah, I do agree with that. So as I talk about, I feel like it's not just about the time, but also it's about sometimes the motions you cannot directly apply all the materials. So it's hard for you to also kind of like filter what is kind of like useful, etc., etc. And especially some of the kind of like debaters, they just to some degree copy these transcripts and then try to just even just use all the similar arguments, but they didn't notice what is the nuance of this motion. So although we kind of like suggest you to have a matterfile, to what degree you want to like use all of them in a tournament is a critical thing for you to decide on your own. And we think that it is better for you to just remember like the most of the things and just check if you have something that is not certain, but don't rely too much on it, especially when you only have 15 minutes. Yep.
Yeah. So originally we have a like case file on voting. So we're going to look at the materials in the voting case file to say what are the materials that are useful. So first looking at the motion says it is a moral duty to participate in democratic process. So probably not everything is useful. We need to like transform some of the argument in the debate, like in the case file to make it related to a moral duty. So the first part we had is general theory. So it's on the nature of voting. So it says like voting is a institutionalized way of turning individual preferences into collective outcomes. So we probably need to try to think about how like making individual preferences into a collective outcome can be a moral duty. So I think some of the way of arguing this can be that democratic participation would only matter if it happens on a scale. Like, so for example, some of the rights, for example, right of freedom of movement, freedom of speech, or a right of demonstration wouldn't matter if it doesn't happen on a scale. The second part is on like different form of voting. Like this is probably not very useful in the debate, so just don't look at it. Then on strategic voting, so probably I think when I look at this, I think this can be something that's preemptive because opposition side can argue that even if people vote, it doesn't really reflect their preferences because there are many propaganda and ways to manipulate how voters vote, and the existing system allows strategic voting, it's not always sincere and doesn't really reflect people's preference. So it on Gov side, I would probably think about that's something that op will say. So usually I'm second speaker and Ray is first speaker. So we will not include this in the constructive material, but this is something that rebuttal speakers should think about while prepping for responses. And then cleavages and party system. So this just means voting is a way to reflect existing social cleavages. So parties form alliances or form their existing policies based on social cleavages. So we can use this to argue that this is important because voters' preference would probably shape how parties act upon these cleavages, what are the policies they're going to push forward. And here, we can also think about something that's more important, probably some of the cleavages only involve the most vulnerable in the society, but exercising voting is a way to help these people as well, so it become a moral duty. So yeah. And then accountability and governance. This can be very easily used, right? So you can argue that in Western democracy, voting makes ruler accountable to citizens. Politicians are agents of voters. So you can argue that because politicians are agents of voters, so you vote for people to not only represent you, but also your community or represent the country. So your votes not only matter to you, but matters to everyone that are going to be affected by this policy. So it's a moral duty for you to not only vote, but also to make responsible voting. Because I have a class on this and it's about comparative politics. So I also added the Chinese context, but it's not very relevant to the debate. And then here, after this, about voting as conflict management. So this is about how voting can bring representation. So the general idea is to say that voting is able to transform conflicts in real life to owning arguments in Congress. So before having voting as a mechanism, the way for people to showcase their dissatisfaction is probably through violence or through overthrowing the government. But after we have democratic process, voting can be a way to showcase, as I said, different social cleavages. So it become conflicts in Congress. So here you can add on this is better than having real life violence because the consequence or cost of that is higher. But I think here you also need to tie back why this is a moral duty. So you can tie the argument that we make at the very beginning about voting would only matter if it happened on a scale, and then the impact of voting on monitoring the state and then conflict management, and tie these two things together. The implication is that everybody need to vote in order to exercise or unlock the benefits that matter not only to you but to everyone, especially the vulnerable in the society, to argue that voting is a moral duty. Then the case studies. The case studies that's most relevant to voting is on Rwanda genocide, because there's a typical argument that suggests that voting leads to Rwanda genocide. So this is probably more helpful for the op side if op side is arguing that voting in itself isn't a moral duty, especially when voting in the status quo oftentimes isn't responsible. So voters can be easily manipulated by media, manipulated by political propaganda, so it doesn't really unlock the benefits that Gov side mentioned about. Then Rwanda genocide will be a very, very good example that opposition side can use to argue why voting is, especially irresponsible voting, is actually going to be more harmful rather than beneficial. then there are some like comparative case studies that we provided below. I think for the case studies, you don't need to explain the mechanism for every case study. Sometimes it's just like name calling. So you can just say, oh, like the case in India, like the case in Kenya, blah, 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 blah. And then can we scroll down a bit? Thank you. And then we also have some of the common clashes that we summarize, like about voting. So stabilizing versus destabilizing. So like we argue, this is like, if you're arguing stabilizing, it's like the case I said, moving conflicts to Congress. Destabilizing will be the case like Rwanda and Kenya, like majoritarianism versus proportional representation. The first one is on like voting sometimes can be like a majority tyranny. So like this can be a very good way for op to respond to like gossip argument on voting only matter if it happens on a scale. So you can say that voting itself is exactly problematic because it would only reflect preferences that are able to be collectivized into like a scaling decision, something like that. And then voting versus alternative legitimacy. So like you can say there are other ways for like citizens to probably exercise their obligation to help minorities or to like hold the government accountable rather than just voting. The last one is whether voting can be like responsible. So like voter rationality and media. So anyways, if you look at the case file, I think it's like me and Ray mentioned before, it's probably quite hard for you to directly find some materials that you can read off. So it's more a reflection on the existing knowledge that you have and how to repackage it to the debate. And similarly, like case file is not only for your own side, it's also for the opposing side. So like when I'm prepping debate with Ray and also like with other partners, the thing that we ask each other the most would be what would be the arguments coming from our opponents. So like I think having a case file can also remind you of what are the arguments that your opponents can use. This is especially important for two reasons. First, it can help your argument to be more relevant. So especially if you're prepping for lower house, so you don't just mention about something that's, locked out of the debate. But second of all, this can also help like the deputy speaker, especially like for us, because we're EFL speaker. So like it's hard to think about very effective language on spot. So sometimes during prep time, I will also have to write some blocks. So like having a case file that reminds you of the argument of the opposing side can also help you to prepare for some of the responses too.
Yeah. I think also like the showcase here, I think the way we actually do it is not like we just scan through like all of them and see whether or not this apply. It's more likely to be we come up with argument ourselves, and if we have some of the arguments we feel like we might have already prepped, then we can just look at that case file instead of just like looking at all of them and try to figure out, because sometimes like your intuition or the argument you come up with on your own is probably the most relevant instead of like the one that you have written in the case file. So I think it's just a showcase in terms of how we are probably going to use that when we actually think about the one argument and there are some materials that might apply, instead of like we necessarily like filter out everything in an actual round. Yep.
Mm. Okay, so I think this will be all for the sharing that we have. Hopefully you will find something useful in it, and good luck for the future tournaments that
Yep.
you're going to participate in.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.